my math grade.
We good? Okay, cool. All right, so yesterday we finished with Britain, is that correct?
Yes.
We're looking at how Britain had kind of gone on this arc to suggest that they could avoid violent revolution if they start behaving better. And the means in which they did that was that they successfully transitioned from old school conservatism, dominated by the Tories, landowning aristocrats protecting their own interests, to a place where they started to at least bring the middle class into the franchise. And it changes the dynamic of the House of Commons to the point that we start to see Whig legislation replace the old Tory legislation, which means more free trade. It means kind of opening up the borders a little bit. Eventually, what's the term? Where you repealing the Corn Laws. Somebody in first period mentioned that the leader of the Anti-Corn Law League was Richard Cobden. And that one of the leaders of the Liberals in opposition to the Corn Laws was a guy named William Cobbett. So you've got a couple of nice corn references there to help you remember who some of the people are. Anyway, so we're looking at Ireland. And Ireland is, if Britain is on this in almost like the model path in terms of avoiding revolution or violence and making adaptations throughout the course of the 19th century to bring more people into the franchise and make, liberals or middle class people and eventually working class people feel like they matter in the political system. They do have a couple of hang-ups. One of them is the women's question, and we're not going to get to that in this unit, but eventually, looks like it might stop. Eventually, like the next unit, we'll start getting into the women's rights movement because it becomes very, very prominent in Britain in the mid to late 19th century. It will become one of the most enduring questions as we lead up to World War I. The other is the Irish. Okay, so the deal with the Irish is this, and there's a really important piece of legislation that's passed in 1829 called the Catholic Emancipation Act. Right? This is really important for Ireland. Does anybody know what it replaced? There was a piece of legislation that was passed under King Charles II in the 17th century that more or less said that so-called nonconformists could not hold political office, could not maintain certain civic administrative posts, could not maintain certain educational posts. All right, and that thing was in place really since 1673. Does anybody know what it's called? Charles II. It is the Test Act, man. That's pretty damn good. Yes, the Test Act. Because they were fearful of Puritans, but they were mostly fearful of the Catholics. Okay? And remember, that was one of the reasons why they ended up having the Glorious Revolution, was the fear that James II was ultimately going to turn England back into a Catholic state. All right? Strange as that is, they handled their political revolution and they solved their religious problems at the same time. But this really sucks for Ireland, because Ireland ultimately is incorporated into this union called Great Britain, which means the Irish people are subject to the laws that are passed in London. All right. Now, if you have the Test Act in place, that means that the only voices that the Irish can have as they sit in the British Parliament are Protestant voices. Well, what does that mean? What percentage of the Irish are Protestant?
Zero.
Well, I wouldn't say it's zero, but I would say that a lot of the people that basically, if you looked at like apartheid South Africa, that's kind of what Ireland looked like. Meaning that the political entities that controlled Irish voices were a small landowning elite made up mostly of descendants of Welsh, Scottish, and English settlers. Because during the confrontations that Ireland had had over the course of 300 years, not only did the English go in and beat up the Irish, but then they took their land and turned a lot of Irish peasants into tenant farmers, without any land and then any political voice. All right, besides all of the violence that was committed as well. So the Catholic Emancipation Act is a big move. because what it does is it now allows for authentic Irish voices to take their seats in Parliament. Okay? And that means that at least two issues are going to be dealt with here. One of them is home rule. Okay? That's what they call it. But home rule means basically Irish, Ireland for the Irish. It's a nationalist movement. All right? And the idea that Ireland would be asserting its right, to self-governance as opposed to being really a subject nationality of Ireland. The second thing is going to be land reform, and it's going to deal with those hundreds of years of the Irish losing their lands in conflicts where their lands are ultimately turned over to absentee landowners, and mostly, like I said, of English, Welsh, or Scottish descent. Okay? So the first real voice in Irish politics, I guess you would say, authentic voice, is this man named Daniel O'Connell. And the political end of this nationalist movement is called the Repeal Association. So they're trying to handle this business through a political process where the British Parliament would actually enact legislation to grant Ireland home rule. And they're starting to lay the foundations for that now. All right, and obviously, like, the voices are going to get a little bit louder. All right, when we get into like the Young Ireland movement, when we start getting into like the Irish Republican Army, when we start getting into Sinn Féin and some of these other organizations that are more militant about the possibilities of getting home rule for Ireland, and that's when it blows up into big conflict. So this is the political arm of that. Okay. And then here's the event that most likely signals the fact that Ireland isn't going to play nice anymore. All right. Now, besides Julia, is there anybody in here that knows what the difference is between an act and an omission? And we certainly looked, remember when we did that trolley thing? When we were looking at Immanuel Kant, you guys remember that stuff? Where like the trolley gets diverted off the tracks and then like kills somebody? Okay, so the idea of the omission is that you don't act, okay, when you have the capacity to act. And the act is itself like a deliberative thing where I am taking an action to like have an outcome, all right? So the calls of genocide exist in both facets, all right? And so when I say genocide, what do most people think of? Somebody in first period yells, Rwanda. And that's great. That's good that somebody did that and recognized that genocide happens to people of color. Okay? But when most people think of genocide, the immediate thought that they have is the Holocaust. Thank you. All right? Jonestown was, it was cold.
The Kool-Aid.
It wasn't, I would say it was genocide.
It's a massacre.
It was a mass murder.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Anyway, okay,
Technical
so
murder terms.
anyway, yeah, but most people's minds go to the Holocaust. That is an active form of genocide, the final solution, where there was actual processes to eliminate a group of people from the face of the earth. Okay, the charges of genocide that were levied during the Irish potato famine are omission-based genocide. All right, but the Irish feel as strongly, and some of them today. Like if you were to go to a tavern or something like that and bring up the Irish potato famine, they'd probably tell you, that it was a genocide that was carried out by Britain through omission as opposed to act, or commission as it's known. Okay? So the deal is, the genocide might have become predictable because of this tenant farming situation, and where the Irish peasants are tied to lands and they are forced to basically harvest off of that land to pay their rent payments to these English landowners. All right? And they've got to get a lot of bang for their buck. And Irish land itself wasn't the most fertile that you would find. In a lot of places, the growing seasons are pretty short, and you're dealing with a lot of cold and damp and inclement weather, and they found out that the potato was the hardiest thing that they could grow. All right? And it had vitamins, and it was able to withstand the elements, and it was able to feed large populations. So unfortunately, Ireland kind of one-trick ponies their economy off of potato. The potato farming and the potato being as important to them as shrimp was to Bubba from Forrest Gump. Okay, it was the be-all, end-all of everything. The problem is something happens to the potato crop. What is the alternative? And that's where they went. All right, they are stuck on the idea that they put all of their, I guess, potatoes in one basket. I know it's a bad joke. I apologize. As I get older, I make more of them. Okay. So the potato famine is that it's a blight. It was like a fungus that had developed on the potato that was turning them black, and ultimately it was obviously it was going to wipe out good portions of the harvest. Without an alternative to fall back on, without free trade, because the corn laws had more or less tied it down to the point where what they produced is what they produced. The Irish were in real deep doo-doo with this one. Okay, there are estimates that there were somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million Irish that would die in the 1840s from either malnutrition or the diseases that made them vulnerable or the malnutrition made them vulnerable to the diseases. And then probably another 2 to 3 million Irish were going to leave the country. Okay. Here's the part where they kind of and this is from like an Irish history book, but they talk about how there is at least arguments against the idea that Britain had committed genocide. All right, one of them is to suggest that there was a number of people. They say British officials in Ireland worked energetically to mitigate the disaster. Often they contributed their own money to feed the poor. A number of British physicians fell victim to fever while treating the sick. Britons, including the Queen and members of the royal family, donated to famine relief. British religious groups, particularly the Quakers, raised relief funds, ministered to the sick, and distributed food to the hungry. The government spent a fortune attempting to soften the blow of the famine. In the first year alone, Peel's administration, Robert Peel, like potato peel, so there's another link, okay, spent £8 million on famine relief. Anybody that's studied the New Deal knows that that's only one of the 3 R's, right? Okay, relief is a short-term mitigatory type of thing, but recovery and reconstruction are the other elements, and those were nowhere to be found. All right, and that's the other thing. Not to mention the fact, the same thing that happened to Jews that were leaving Germany in the middle of the 1930s, trying to get away from the pending disaster, that were being turned away at ports. The British were putting up all kinds of barriers to allow Irish to resettle as refugees, because they're ultimately in a refugee crisis. But they're basically saying, we don't want any Irish. A lot of the Irish ended up going to the United States. We know that. All right. It got to a point, and this is a big impact. Like, Ireland lost half of its population over the course of the 1800s. All right. That's rare. At a time when the regular population of Europe had gone from 188 to 432 million by the end. That's like a 270% increase. All right, Ireland lost half of its population. To the running joke that there was more Irish in New York and Boston than there was in Ireland in the 19th century. Right. So here's the part where they suggest, Britain did stuff, but did they also allow it to happen? All right. And this is what they said. The Whig government's famine response gave Irish nationalists reason to raise the genocide charge. At a time when the Irish were dying of hunger and disease or fleeing the country, Britain was the most prosperous country in the world. Its politicians did not use the full resources of the UK to save Ireland, committed to laissez-faire dogmatism, and if you know what that means, that's classical liberals that are saying, hey, do we really want to give all this stuff to the poor? Let's let the laws of supply and demand and nature kind of dictate how things are going to go. Well, that's a hell of a thing to say to a poor and starving person. All right? But that's what they mean. They didn't provide enough food to meet the Irish need, did not design the sort of public works projects that would provide food buying income while at the same time stimulating the economy. Government officials argue that famine relief should not interfere with normal commercial activity, compete with private business, discourage personal initiative, make the Irish people psychologically dependent on relief, okay, or charity, or interfere with the private property or private responsibility. And then some of them said, hey man, what a gift this is. Because remember, I mean, if anybody's like heard of like Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, the idea that there was overpopulation in Ireland had always been kind of on everybody's plates. Oh my God, did I just say that? That was not intentional.
That's funny.
Because it's a modest proposal.
But,
You know what I'm saying? Okay. So anyway, but that a Malthusian disaster would be that there is some corrective to overpopulation, and this was like a gift that was levied by the gods to get rid of all the extra Irish. Okay, and that there were people in the English government, the British government, that were actually saying that, like, wow, this is such a relief that we've now effectively lost half of Ireland's population. All right. They said they believed that the Irish famine was a beneficial Malthusian disaster. In its darkest hours, Nassau Sr., a famous economist high in the councils of the Whig administration, lamented that only 1 million would die from famine causes. And that was not sufficient to solve the Irish surplus population problem. Like all the refugees that were leaving Syria, if we could just get a nice tidal wave in the Mediterranean, that would wipe them all out. That would solve all of the concerns we have on what we're supposed to do with relocating the refugees. It's about that callous. Charles Edward Trevelyan, Under-Secretary of the Treasury, and the person most responsible for the government's relief program, decided that the famine was divine retribution on a wicked, perverse people. Like the Irish didn't really deserve to live. Okay. So, with all that in mind, you could see where maybe the next half of the 19th century is conditioned by the event that sort of signaled the end of the first half of the 19th century. And the Irish were like, home rule is almost a moral necessity now, because if we're waiting on the British to help us, we're never going to get it. Okay. The only way that we can help ourselves is by becoming an independent state and dictating our own future. All right. As long as we're tied to Britain, we're ultimately victims of the next time they decide that they want to relocate some of the surplus Irish population. Okay. All right, let's move on then. France. The most ridiculous place to imagine that the French Revolution never happened was in France. Okay. But yet, amongst all of the countries at the Congress of Vienna, they got together and kind of like Wonder Twinned this idea that they could go and pretend that 30 or 40 years of history never took place. All right. France was one of the places where they tried to adopt that principle. So the idea of restoring legitimacy meant that while they were all there trying to find legitimate political leadership in France, they wanted to find a Bourbon. Because that was the monarchy, the ruling dynasty that was in place before Louis got decapitated. So they're looking around for another Louis, and surely there is another Louis. And he takes his place as the King of France. As if 1789 to 1815 did not happen, they restored the Bourbon monarchy to France. Now this guy came along and he said all the right things. They had this thing called the Constitutional Charter of 1814, which is similar to what the British put together in 1688. The idea that he's going to respect freedom of speech and press and assembly and the gains that were made in the night of August the 4th, and that there would be a chamber of peers and a chamber of deputies, and that legislature would share power with the king. Okay? And he went along with it. And so if you really look at the first 12 years, they're a functional constitutional monarchy. But the reality is, remember when I told you that only 6% of the adult population in Britain had enough property qualifications to vote or to be able to take seats in the House of Commons? France's population is 30 million. There were 100,000 eligible voters based on the property qualifications. So imagine how that's going to go down in a country that 20 years early had universal suffrage. To go back to the idea that there's these massive political or these property requirements now. Okay? Nonetheless, he navigates. All right? But he doesn't have a son that he can pass on the crown to, so the crown's going to get passed on to his brother, and it turns out that his brother is part of a faction called the Ultra-Royalists. All right, the name I gave them was White Terror Rejects, or Metternich on acid. Okay, this guy, the Count of Artois, is among the group of people that lost during the French Revolution, but were upset about every single capacity in which they lost. So his goal was, I want to restore the titles, the lands, the prestige, and the property of all of my royal buddies. Okay? Like, I'm going to make that happen. And so he becomes, really by default, the next king of France after Louis XVIII dies. He takes the crown as Charles X. All right? And he has a 5-hour coronation ceremony in Reims Cathedral, just to kind of like, look, it's the 1700s again. Oh, check that. It's the 1600s again. I am the new Louis XIV. All right. First thing that he does is he reduces the interest rate on bonds. All right. Now you got to think about that, but who buys bonds? Middle-class citizens generally, people that invest, right? And they're looking for a return on their investment. So the idea is I buy this bond which will fund the treasury, and in exchange, in like 10, 15 years or whatever, I get a 5 or 10% return on that investment. Well, he reduced the amount that you're going to get as a return on the investment, and then takes the proceeds of those reductions and hands it off to a whole bunch of nobles. It says here is the first of many compensation packages for all the land and wealth and titles that you guys lost during the French Revolution. The middle class finds out about it, and obviously they're pretty pissed. So now the French, who are pros, by the way, at revolution, are starting to recognize that Charles is not playing by the rules. And they start to become vocal. And when they become vocal, what does Charles do? It's like he gets the handbook out, how to get overthrown in 180 days. All right? He immediately disbands a lot of the assemblies, refuses to meet the Chamber of Deputies, which, by the way, was the thing that Charles I did to get decapitated in the 1640s. It's now 1820s. All right? And he's doing it in France, which invented political revolution. So they start to barricade, and they start to do the things that we would imagine French people do. They take to the streets. What does he do? He shoots at them. Okay? What do the French do at that point? Shoot back. They have a revolution, because that's what they do. I mean, for God's sakes, they had family members that had died during the original revolution for rights that are now being taken away from them. And they're like, enough is enough. So they do what they do, which is the French have revolutions. You know, some people eat, go to the movies. They have revolutions. All right? The cool thing that happens in the 19th century is that European history tends to name things after the months in which they occur. So, this revolution of 1830 happened in July, hence it is known as the July Revolution. Okay? So now the king abdicates. Right? There's this place where all of the renegade nobles go, the people that piss off the people and get chased out of the country, they all go into witness protection program. So like the upper New Hampshire of Europe is Britain. Like all of the old royalists or whatever, once they get thrown out of their own countries, they end up in Britain. So Charles X is in Britain. Okay, and now the French are back to square, 9 or whatever it is, where they're stuck with the idea of we've got to form a new government. Okay, so they sit down and they've got this group. Believe it or not, Prince Talleyrand is still alive and is still there. And so he meets with a group of advisors. One's name is Francois Guizot. The other is this guy named Adolphe Thiers, back when having the name Adolphe was okay. All right. So between the three of them, they sit down and they try to figure out what they're going to do next. And what they decide to do is create a constitutional monarchy. Because it worked so well in 1789, 91, 93, and then now here it is, they tried again in 1814. They're like, fifth time's a charm. We're going to go with constitutional monarchy. All right. Why did they have no choice? Why didn't they just say, look, monarchy is always going to go bad. It's always going to look out for the interest of like the old elite. Why the hell don't we just have a republic and be done with it? That's the answer. She just gave it to you. Remember the Holy Alliance? Remember, we're only 15 years removed from Napoleon. The rest of Europe knows that. And they know that when France becomes a republic, France ultimately ends up with Robespierre's or Napoleon's. And neither one of those is a good outcome. So it's almost like the French tempered their consequence and said, we're going to go with monarchy again. That way nobody gets rattled. We'll hope for the best and imagine that this one is going to work correctly. Charles is gone. Maybe it was just a bad apple. And maybe it's not about the institution monarchy and how it doesn't fit in France. All right, so they find a monarch now from another family. I forget which family it is. But there is some distant relationship that exists between the Bourbons and whoever this new cat is. His name is Louis Philippe. Oh, there you go. He's the cousin of Charles X. He's also the son of a French revolutionary. So they're like, hey, we've got one of ours. All right, his name was Philippe Égalité, who was the Duke of Orleans at the time. Okay? So Louis Philippe and Francois Guizot, who was one of the conservatives that was there, that made the decision that they would be a constitutional monarchy. They decide that they'll have a new constitutional monarchy, and because they elected this guy, or crowned him, monarch, in July, he's known as the July Monarch. His name is Louis Philippe. Okay? The voting scrolls dramatically increased from 100,000 out of 30 million to 170,000 out of 30 million. Okay? Does everybody understand that they have not solved any of their problems? All right. The liberals are still wondering, when are we going to be able to take our seats? Okay. By then, France has evolved. And France has evolved to such a point that the working class, because they are now industrialized and starting to urbanize. We already know that they have a working class. For God's sakes, the sans-culottes were part of the reason why they had an original French Revolution. So all of those issues that liberals want to deal with, and now socialists will want to deal with, because socialism becomes a big component of the 1830s and 40s in France, they're all going to have to confront that. Okay? And this was just an episode, and they actually didn't make any gains whatsoever. So the logic that there will be another French Revolution down the line is about the most predictable thing in the world. Does everybody get me? Okay, now here's a fun little fact. There's a phrase out there, especially in the 19th century, might have even been older than that, but it's, when France sneezes, the rest of Europe catches cold. Okay. France is the pioneer. They are the ones that stir the pot. And every time there's an uprising in France in the 19th century, it encourages other people around Europe to have uprisings. Okay? Remember, they're going to be based on something related to either liberalism, nationalism, or socialism. And that brings us to Belgium. Okay? Now, Belgium doesn't exist yet. But Belgians got in touch with their Belgianness and realized that they weren't Belgian, but that's what they were proposing, to become an independent state known as Belgium. What they are is they are the 10 in the original 7-10 split. You guys remember the 7-10 split? It goes all the way back to the 1500s when the Netherlands was revolting against Philip II. And what they ultimately settled on was the 7 northern provinces declared independence and eventually became the Netherlands. And the 10 provinces that were predominantly agrarian and Catholic stayed with Spain. So from I guess it would have been 1579 until 1713, they were referred to as the Spanish Netherlands. After the Treaty of Utrecht, they were passed on to Austria. And then from 1713 to 1815, they were referred to as the Austrian Netherlands. After Vienna, they were turned over to the Netherlands. So now the Netherlands possesses these 17 provinces, but those 10 provinces in the south, they don't identify with the 7 provinces in the north. They seem to believe that they are a distinct and separate people. And so they are asserting their independence. And what's cool about it is that they're doing it next to the Netherlands. All right? Now, when we think of the Netherlands and Amsterdam now, what do you think of? All right, she thinks of architecture. I think of marijuana. Okay? So I imagine somebody in Amsterdam firing up like a really big fat blunt of some kind, right? And they're like, hey man, there's this thing going on in Belgium. And they're like, Belgium? I haven't even heard of Belgium. Well, apparently we like possess them, but they don't want to be possessed. And the Dutch are looking around, they're like, cool. And so the Belgians assert their independence, and the Netherlands almost responds as if they're in a grow house somewhere in Amsterdam. There's no violence, there's no real repercussions from it. It's just sort of like they thought it up, they did it. The Netherlands is like, cool, you guys are Belgium, I dig it. Everybody recognizes it, and then they declare neutrality, and they've got their own king, and they're independent, and everything's groovy. And it was the French uprising that kind of like triggered their movement to become independent. And because they bordered the Netherlands, and the Netherlands was kind of chill about it. Hey, cool. You guys be whatever you want to be. We've decided to be Belgian. I can dig it. Okay. Then the other fun part about this is that Poland finds out about what Belgium did. Okay? So Poland is looking as like, dude, these Belgian dudes, they just like wanted to be independent and then they were independent. Well, we got like broken into a whole bunch of different pieces in the 1790s. We know that we want to be independent. We used to be Poland. I think we should be Poland again. And they're like, if it worked out for these Belgian dudes, it could certainly work for Poland, which has a long history of being Poland. So they have an uprising. What's the difference? Their uprising is next to Russia. Belgium's uprising is next to the Netherlands. So the Netherlands might have like this like cool grow house response. Russia doesn't have that response. Russia has a different response, which is send in the armies and destroy them and say, don't ever do this again. Never, never, never. Okay? Stomp on them with Russian boot. Poland bad, So anyway, yeah, Russia goes postal on the Polish, restores the non-Poland boundary. The Poland from 1794 is still no more. Poland is not going to get to be Poland again until 1918, and then for their sins, they got caught in the backwash between the Soviet Union and the German army. All right, so Poland doesn't really get to be Poland until 1989. All right, but for a couple of shining years. Yes, but those years were not 1830. Okay, so Polish nationalism has to be kind of a weak, feeble, don't hit me kind of nationalism. All right. Nonetheless, it's there. Okay. All right, so that kind of brings us up to the story, and there is like uprisings that are happening. There's German movements that are talking about unification. You'll read in chapter 19 of Viold about this group called the Burschenschaften. It was a bunch of university students that were identifying as German nationalists and trying to get a political arrangement where the German states could unify and become one country. All right, Metternich would have nothing to do with it, and ultimately passed a whole bunch of censorship type of things that he calls the Carlsbad Decrees. You'll read about that. Italy has got really, really big movements now, led by a couple of Giuseppes. One's name is Mazzini, the other is Garibaldi. Okay, and so there's 3 different agencies that are identifying as Italian unification. One of them is called the Young Italian or Young Italy movement. One of them is called the Carbonare. One is this movement called Risorgimento. And all of that is going on in the various Italian city-states, which have been divided forever. Okay, so that's all out there and it's festering. All right. So here's what I'll say about the 1848 revolutions. If you were to guess Where would the 1848 revolution start? What would you say? What would be the beginning point? Because ultimately the 1848 revolutions are going to fan out all over Europe at the same time. The only two states that are not really impacted by it, one of them is Britain and the other one is Russia. But everything in between in continental Europe is going to face uprisings of some combination of liberalism, nationalism, and socialism fighting against conservatism. Okay? There will be uprisings in Paris, there will be uprisings in Bucharest, there will be uprisings in Prague, in Berlin, all over the Italian city-states, in Vienna. It's like a massive, conservatism tried like hell to hold on to this pre-French Revolution conception of the universe, and 1848 is when the liberals, socialists, and nationalists could not take it anymore. Okay? Where do you suppose, geographically, the 1848 revolutions would start? Who invents revolution? France. Okay, and they start in February. So between February and then probably the late summer, there are revolutions all over the place. Okay? My homework for you is to read Viault chapter 22, or you could read the Mackay stuff on the 1848 revolutions, or you could read the Spielvogel stuff on the 1848 revolutions. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you an overview right now. Okay? And it almost makes Edmund Burke seem a little bit like a prophet again. Okay? Because they all follow the exact same narrative. Okay? All of these people rise up and revolt. They're revolting against the conservative order. That much they could do. All right? So, in all of those revolutions, in Vienna, and in Hungary, and in Bohemia, and in the German states and the Italian states, they're all able to rise up against the conservative order. And some combination of liberals, nationalists, and socialists are going to rise up and then force the conservatives to either abdicate outright or to make concessions to say, we will let these things occur. Then stage two will be, they don't know what to do next. Okay? That's what Burke said. When you tear up the roots of the old conservative experience, they don't know where to go next. They don't know what the guide is supposed to be. So if you look at France, and France is a really unique experience because what happened there is essentially a duplicate of what happened in France over the course of 1789 to about 1794. Is that the liberal bourgeoisie tried to gain control of the revolution, but then they didn't include the working class people. Okay? So the very nature of France is they both all collectively decided that the king had to go. But then what the nature of the new government was going to be, there was massive fighting between those that identified with the working class and those that identified with the liberal bourgeoisie. And it was so bad in France that it ended up blowing up into a civil war. And you'll never guess who got to be there to pick up the pieces. What did they end with? So, step one, overthrow Louis Philippe. Step two, fight amongst yourselves to the point that it blows up into an outright civil war, with the working class on one side and the liberal bourgeoisie supported by some peasant landowners on the other. And in order to give France some stability again and get them out of civil war, what did they ultimately agree to? Another pseudo-consulate led by another Bonaparte. This time the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, he was known as Louis Napoleon Bonaparte.
Like his actual cousin?
Huh?
Like his actual cousin?
His actual nephew.
Oh, but why?
Because he had name recognition as somebody that could provide France stability, but he also had some kind of like modern liberal-esque ideas. So they thought he would be like Napoleon without like trying to take over the world. Does that make sense? And he was a really, really good politician. We're going to look at him. But he still had Bonaparte in his head and ended up ruining him. Right. But anyway, so that's kind of what the protocol will be, is that initially there will be an overthrow of the conservative order in some fashion. Step 2, there will be infighting about what to do next. Step 3, the conservatives will get their nerve back and they will destroy the movement. And then they will restore conservative order. Okay? So all of the revolutions, at least in some regard, could be considered failures. All right? And all of them, the reason why is because there were fractures about what they wanted to do next. Like if you looked at Catalonia, for instance, right now, there's a fear. There's a whole bunch of different people with different ideas about what would happen in Catalonia if they actually did get their independence. What would happen next? And there's 3 different political parties that might identify as being pro-independence, but they don't know what the nature of that pro-independence would be. Okay? And so it's like they don't know what to do with it once they get it. All they know is that they got problems with Spain. But they don't know what the new thing would look like. And that's the lesson here of 1848. And that's kind of the lesson that Edmund Burke gave them is, you guys don't have an anchor. You don't really know how, to take the next step. Steps need to happen in over the course of time, okay? And there's people that are like, well, we don't have that long to wait. All right? That the oppression that we feel is now, and that needs to be eliminated. And we'll work out the details later, but we know that this thing has got to go. All right? Maybe that's true. All right, does everybody understand what's going on? Tomorrow, then, here's what we can do with class. I can either talk a lot about the Revolution of 1848, or you guys could actually read about the Revolution of 1848, and then I could answer questions that you might have about some of the specifics of it. And then, if there isn't a lot of questions, we could just proceed to preparing for the exam. Okay? So you guys decide what tomorrow's class looks like. All right. But that puts responsibility on you. And we are now up to 30 out of 44 on the PSD number 2.
Woo.
I have people that have turned in their PSDs by email. My response, although it might sound like it's curt and sarcastic, is always going to be, thank you. Please submit to turn it in. Or I might say something like, hey, that's great. Please submit to turn it in. Or, way to go, kid. Now submit to turn it in. Yeah, you can turn that off.
Yeah, whatever.
All right, got it. Thanks, dude.
No problem.